Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Climate Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan Public Workshop. Today is January 23rd, 2024. I'm Alec Bogdanoff. I'm one of the sub-consultants on the Tetra Tech team working with them on this project. I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So first and foremost, this is a workshop to really get your feedback, and we want to make sure that you all have that opportunity. So throughout the course of this workshop and in the specific Q&A portion, we are going to respond to your questions. And so we would ask that at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device, there's a Q&A function. If you click it, you can ask a question. For some questions, we'll be able to answer them live and respond to you, especially if it's a clarification question. Otherwise, we will try to answer your questions during the Q&A portion. And so again, this webinar is being recorded as well, and so will be available for folks to review after the fact as well. And if there are any other specific items, you are able to use the chat function to get a hold of the panelists directly if there's a technical issue or otherwise. And then if we do have time at the end, we will allow folks to raise their hands and ask brief questions live. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Allison Higgins and to go a little bit into the welcome.
Hello all. This is going to reverb on me for a little bit. Does it sound weird to anybody else? Shake your hand.
Yes.
We're going to do this old school. Everybody, my name is Allison Higgins. I'm sustainability. I'm incredibly excited that so many of you have tuned in for our first of many opportunities to share and learn about how climate change is predicted to affect our island and what we can do to be ready for that change. Did you know there's a tidal gauge in Key West that has collected the longest span of data
Apologies, folks.
Right. With that in mind, I want to introduce our guides on this process, Georgia Vince from Tetra Tech and Aaron DDPA, who together have decades of experience in all things adaptation for communities big and small. Take it away, Georgia.
Thanks, Allison. Really quick, everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about the Climate Vulnerability Assessment and the Adaptation Plan that we're working on for the City of Key West. Just a little bit of our agenda. We're going to go over some team introductions, the project objectives, discuss the community input opportunities, the project components so that you understand what the goals are, and we'll look ahead to the expectations of the project results and our timeline. And we should have time at the end of the presentation for any questions and answers you may have that we didn't cover today. As I mentioned, or as Allison mentioned, my name is Georgia Vince. I work for Tetra Tech. We've got some pretty significant experience working with the city on all types of projects. With me today is Aaron Dede and Clearview Geographic, and they've been working on the Monroe County Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Strategies for several years to support resiliency planning projects. Alex with Brazaga is here. He's supporting all of our community outreach efforts, and Balmoral Group will help with our economic analysis, and Search is on our team to support any cultural and historic adaptation projects that we may identify. Stantec is also on our team, another engineering firm that we are closely coordinating efforts on the Duval Street revitalization plan. So overall, our project's objectives are to evaluate flooding threats related to climate change impacting the city of Key West. We want to look at community assets that are at risk in the area, and then we will use a data-driven and analysis and multidisciplinary approach to evaluate those risks. We'll develop an adaptation plan to make the city safer and more prepared to respond to these events. We will evaluate some economic harm from climate impacts, and we look forward to harmonizing efforts to address hazard mitigation through the federal, state, and local levels. Lastly, we look to identify opportunities to fund projects that the city will need to become more resilient that will be identified in the adaptation plan. So the focus of our climate threat analysis will include some impacts that are already being experienced in Key West. Impacts from sea level rise, from the effects of climate change, high tide flooding from extreme events, storm surge resulting from hurricanes and wind events, rainfall-induced flooding, and then compound flooding, which is a combination of all of these types of events at once, causing, extreme conditions. So the first way we want to collect some input from our audience today is using a tool called Mente. And this tool can be accessed on any browser, either on your cell phone or in another window on your computer if you're at home. And you can go to menti.com either by scanning the QR code or putting in menti.com in your browser and entering the code that's on the screen, that 34790281. So if y'all would go to menti.com in one of those ways and enter the code, and we will go through some of these questions live, and we'll be able to see live audience results as you respond to the questions. So the first question, I'll give it another second for people to join. I think you can tell how many people are joining. The first question is, which climate threat are you most concerned about? So if you go to menti.com and you plug in the code that's at the top of the screen now, you should be able to see answers start popping in. I know there's more than 4 people on the line, so we're trying to get as much input and feedback from the audience as possible. And as you see, the bars on the graph will change as answers come in from the audience. We have 14 people participating at this time, with compound flooding being the most concerned threat. All right, we still got votes coming in. This is great. I really appreciate everyone's participation and input. It really does tell us a lot about the community's concerns, and we can incorporate those concerns into our study. All right, votes are still coming in. All right, it looks like we have over half of you all responding at 27. We have 44 participants at this time, which is great. Happy to have you all here, giving us your feedback. All right, I am gonna move on to the next slide. You all can stay on your other device, and the next question that we have in a few slides will automatically pop up when we reach that slide. So what do we do about these threats? How do we become more resilient? So there's a couple of strategies, 2 main strategies. for climate resiliency, adaptation, which is preparing for climate change impacts, and mitigation, which is looking at ways to fix the cause of the climate change. The goal being more resilient communities recover from and bounce back faster from disruptions and hazard-related events. Some really quick examples of adaptation and mitigation strategies are on the screen here. I'll be going over a few of those in more detail, but examples of adaptation are elevating buildings, improving stormwater management, restoring natural habitat for buffers, and updating codes and policies. And mitigation examples are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, by doing that by increasing public transportation opportunities, water conservation, and enhancing natural areas. So with those few examples, we're going to take another quick poll on Mente to ask you, which adaptation strategies do you want the city to do more of by 2050 to address future flooding risks? And so this question should automatically pop up on your screen, and as the audience responds, we'll see which adaptation strategy gets the most votes. And I think we coded this one so you can have multiple answers. All right, we got 24 people responding. This is great. If anybody joined late, I believe there were a couple of late attendees. You can go to menti.com on your phone or another screen on your computer and enter the code, and you can participate in these polling opportunities as well. All right, responses are still coming in. This is great. All right, 30. I think that's a great tally of the audience. And so with that, I'm going to carry on in the presentation and hand it over to Erin, who is going to get into the details about the project purpose for the climate vulnerability assessment.
So the state of Florida has been funding these vulnerability assessments and resilient planning projects across the state of Florida for local governments to do all of these things. Start evaluating risks focused on the assets that a city owns and maintains, or other community assets that you all rely upon, or services, or certain buildings or facilities. Secondly, we want to measure the impacts of the potential climate threats. Under this program, it's largely related to flood risk. In fact, it's entirely related to flood risk. Prioritizing adaptation actions with this specific project, it's broken down into various chapters of the final document to make sure that certain subject areas are covered in the overall planning effort. And then understanding the magnitude, severity, and extent of the various flood scenarios that we are running, which includes sea level rise, rainfall, tidal flooding, storm surge, and various combinations of those flood scenarios. The idea is to make sure that the recommendations and the outputs from this project are living and breathing within the city's decision making. So we want to make sure that we can integrate those into policies within the comprehensive plan and provisions within the code of ordinances. And then finally, one of the biggest things that this planning effort will do is hopefully set the city up to be able to construct projects on other people's money through grants and various state and federal funding opportunities. And having a planning document, a cohesive plan with priorities and projects, is a great way to do that and makes you look really good in these grant applications. And so what are the risks of climate change? So the state of Florida puts up some guardrails and wants us to evaluate these climate risks, these flooding risks, in a certain way. The first thing they want us to do is look at exposure or risk. And that's the degree to which the water comes up upon an area or affects a critical asset. The sensitivity is how much that will impact that particular asset. It will impact a tiki hut a whole heck of a lot differently than it will impact your stormwater infrastructure or your roads. And as we know, in the Keys, road flooding and stormwater is something that we see during various flooding events. And then the ability to respond. How do we have that ability to respond? Can we respond quickly? Does it take us days to respond? We know that during hurricane events, sometimes it's more challenging to get supplies and be able to respond. So we want to know how important is that asset or that service in the community, and how quickly can we bounce back from some type of flooding event. This is our roadmap, literally a roadmap for all the different steps in the planning process. We are going to be collecting and have been collecting a lot of data, and that data comes from a lot of different sources. First and foremost, it comes from the city itself. It may come from the county. The state has data sets. It has also natural resources information, and the federal government has a lot of information about assets as well. So we pull all of that asset information together so we can characterize the community and figure out what's really important to you. Public outreach and engagement, this is the first wave of that effort. We are going to be then evaluating and have been evaluating some of the hazards and risks that we've talked about, largely focused on the flooding. Look at the various assets, identify adaptation strategies. We have a final report. And then what we want to do at the same time concurrent with that is identify certain prioritized hotspots, we call them, of flooding. And the flooding may be more inland, it may be related to rain events, or it may be more along the coast where it's influenced by winds and tide or storm surge. And then we can prioritize projects and identify what strategies we want to utilize to be able to respond to that and mitigate that vulnerability to flooding with various projects. We want to do a cost benefit analysis, identify funding strategies, and then have a 10-year adaptation plan with project suggestions and policy suggestions for moving forward based on all of this evaluation that we're going to be doing. And what makes this unique? Well, we know that the Keys in general is a unique geography, unique topography, being an island chain 100 miles long, and Key West is at the end of that island chain. And so you do have unique challenges, very different than other communities that may be on the mainland. And we need to recognize those challenges as being unique during different emergency and storm and rainfall events. So we are collecting very specific city data on your assets and regional assets that may be within your community upon which you depend during flood scenarios or during hurricane events. Flood inundation mapping, where is the water going to go, when, how high, what type of rainfall or storm surge or tidal flooding event is making that rainfall inundate that particular area. And then we are going to be evaluating all of these assets and looking for areas where we've got aggregations of assets and flooding at the same time to create those hotspot areas. The community engagement, we're going to work with the city. We have a public engagement plan to go to where the people are to make sure that we are providing that information through multiple sources so you get it and you see it as we're generating it. And this is obviously an interesting grant because it's funded both by a Resilient Florida grant and a Department of Commerce grant, which is flow through money from the federal government. So this is 100% grant funded and is an incredible opportunity for the city to do some really nitty-gritty resiliency planning work. So vulnerability assessment requirements are dictated to us by the state of Florida. They want us to look at both the NOAA intermediate low and high sea level rise projections for 2040. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they update their projections every couple of years. So we have very specific projections that we have to use for this vulnerability assessment. We have to look at sea level rise, tidal flooding, storm surge, and compound flooding. I like to call that the mashup scenario. And we know we see those scenarios in the Keys where you have an October king tide, and then you have a rain event come through, or a late season hurricane that may be offshore that's pushing the wind in a certain direction. You know, we know that we see those compound flooding events. So they're not some far-fetched impact that's never going to happen, because we actually are seeing some of those events now. These unified sea level rise projections from the Southeast Regional Climate Compact are similar. That NOAA intermediate high is the high condition in terms of rise from a 2000 baseline that we're going to be looking at for 2040 and 2070. It's 17 inches of sea level rise and 40 inches of sea level rise. We will also be doing on top of that the 2100 condition, because it harmonizes with other resiliency planning efforts that you have going on in the city. So these are the minimum requirements of the state, and we will be meeting and exceeding them. The asset classes are also dictated to us by the state of Florida. We have to look at transportation, critical infrastructure, critical community and emergency facilities, and then of course, natural resources, cultural resources, and historic resources. For instance, shorelines, parks, conservation lands, all things that are important to the city of Key West. And we have been working to compile that data and integrate all of that data into one data set. We call that a baseline asset inventory, and that pulls from those state, regional, and federal resources, including the city's resources and the counties, to make sure that we are accounting for every important asset, facility, and service that you may depend upon. And so this next question is, what services or facilities would be the most important to you during or after a climate event? And this could be a prolonged flooding event. And so the question is it hospital medical services, emergency fire rescue, transportation services, essential government services, something like emergency permitting, other essential community services like waste management, or your utilities, water and electric. So we're looking for responses from you on what you prioritize in your day-to-day life. Here we go. We appreciate the feedback. We'll keep this open a few more seconds here. What are we keeping them open? A minute? Something like that.
And we really appreciate everyone taking the time to give us your input. The information will be utilized in the study process. So we're glad that you're providing your input today.
So it looks like the overwhelming majority, well, not the overwhelming majority, the majority are coalesced around emergency services, the hospital, obviously, and then water and electric utilities.
All right.
Great, thank you. And so we are in the process of exporting all of the information into a map series, which is going to show what the vulnerability assessment results are. This is an example of one of our inundation maps, and we will be producing this map series, making it available to the city. And what it eventually will do is cross over and cross-reference those critical assets, where we will harmonize the flood risk with where we have those essential facilities and services that you all rely upon. And we will be presenting that output as it's generated and then identifying projects. One thing to note about this map series is you will always see on the left side that projection. This is NOAA intermediate high, which is the NIH. This is the 2070 sea level rise plus high tide flooding. Then in the middle in that box, you will see the inches of rise, and you will again see the scenario and the year. And in that green box where you see a number 2, to make sure that we can zoom into the community enough that you can actually see what's going on in particular areas, we kind of have a area and pagination that's orienting you to the area of the city that we are concentrating on for that particular map. So if number 2 is the area that is most interesting to you, you will see number 2 fairly consistently across the entire map series, and you can look at it across the various map scenarios or flooding scenarios. I'm going to turn it over to Georgia.
All right, great. Thanks, Erin. So once we've completed the vulnerability assessment and identified the vulnerable assets in that report, we'll start preparing your adaptation plan. This plan will identify strategies that include structural and non-structural measures at regional and community scale, and will prioritize these actions to develop a plan to be implemented over the next 10 years. As Erin mentioned, this plan is unique and it has 7 focus area chapters, just specialty topics that the city staff have been identifying over time that really are the heart of what the needs are for the community. We have an infrastructure chapter, an environmental chapter, historic and cultural, economics, housing and shelter, and health and social adaptation chapters. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of what those will look like. The adaptation strategies identified for the chapters will vary, obviously, based on the specialty chapter. We'll have structural flood protection measures or flood proofing. We'll look at stormwater collection systems and pumping stations, wind retrofitting, nature-based solutions, guidelines for future property development in the building codes and the policies for the city. We'll look at and see if there's community outreach and education efforts that are lacking that need to be enhanced. And we'll look at programs to address vulnerable communities within the city. And adaptation strategies may include voluntary land acquisition or relocation of facilities. So just some examples of projects that we've been involved in for utilizing these adaptation strategies. There are a lot of options for flood protection systems with concrete or plastic walls that are designed to handle major storm events. The stormwater systems are designed for protecting the building inside and then also making sure that the water doesn't build up too high on the outside. And these projects may include stormwater pumps to discharge outside of the protection area in order to offset any imbalances. This is an example of a stormwater pump station retrofit where the pumps were below the flood elevations previously. So we elevated the pumps, we elevated the mechanical and electrical components to the pump station. And depending on the project, you may have to increase your capacity of those pump stations. Of course, we want to make sure that all of the electrical are staged above sea level rise and storm surge elevations for future flood events. Another one that's pretty common is seawalls. In this case, we have a new seawall elevated higher than the previous existing wall, also elevated the walkway or the sidewalk. There are opportunities below sidewalks, these types of sidewalks, where you can include stormwater management opportunities where there's space underneath the sidewalk for water to go during a storm event. And then you can also, of course, enhance these types of systems with nature-based solutions or artificial reefs offshore to further dampen any storm surge. So a little bit into the adaptation chapters that will be coming down the line. For the infrastructure, power and water will identify assets at risk, reduce structural vulnerabilities, physically adapt to reduce or eliminate flood risks. These projects will all need to do a cost-benefit analysis in order to ensure that the cost is equitable for the level of service that's being provided. As you can imagine, some project costs may ultimately outweigh the benefits of a particular project in some scenarios. For the environmental chapter, we'll look at the coastlines and habitat shifts and evaluate opportunities for greenways and drainage features. Look at habitat restoration, tree canopy preservation, and nature-based solutions for shoreline protection. For the historic and cultural chapter, adaptation strategies can include elevating buildings, wet and dry proofing buildings, relocation, and stormwater improvements. And sometimes it's the only form of adaptation is to record the memory of a historic property through documentation and making sure that we have historical records associated with it. For the economic chapter, we'll look at risks to businesses, tourism, ports, and government agencies. We will develop strategies based on future challenges and opportunities, and we'll look to adjust financial strategies and policies as needed. We'll also see if there are opportunities to transition to more sustainable practices and mitigate economic risks for the community. For the health and housing and equity chapters, we'll look at affordable housing, identify ways to stabilize rent, look at risks to health and human services, and potentially exposure to environmental contaminants or heat. And we'll ensure that social equity is considered throughout all strategies in the adaptation plan. So the results of the adaptation plan, the second component to the project, will be identifying strategies across the 7 specialized chapters, including planning level cost estimates for infrastructure projects, performing cost-benefit analysis for projects, looking at the policies and the plans, and identifying the funding opportunities for projects using the state and federal grant programs that are available. Once we have all this information pulled together, we'll map out a plan for a 10-year timeline to fund and implement the projects and get things moving to a more resilient community for Key West. Quickly, I wanted to mention a couple other studies and resources that are going on right now. We have the Key West Stormwater Master Plan and ICPR modeling, which is a H&H model that's been developed for the city. The Monroe County Vulnerability Assessment is underway, along with the Monroe County Road Study. Key West is also pursuing a watershed management plan, and the Duval Street Revitalization and Resiliency Project is underway by Stantec. This is our project timeline. We're working toward developing the climate vulnerability assessment to be completed by June of this year. We'll kick off the adaptation plan right afterwards, and we'll have a draft plan for all 7 chapters by February of 2025. We'll have more workshops throughout the process to discuss with you our progress and get input and feedback from the community. And we'll ensure that your voices are heard throughout the process. We plan to have a final adaptation plan and public workshop in August of 2025, and then immediately move into implementation of the projects. Whoops. We have, this one already started. We wanted to ask what tools would be most beneficial for you to stay informed about the city's climate resiliency planning and policies. So if you would go back to your Mente and let us know if you prefer technical reports, a dedicated website, which we do have, I'll mention in a minute. The city does a lot of newsletters, again, we'll have more public workshops, focus groups, and then text and email opportunities. Just making sure it's working. Yeah. Oh, I don't think it's working. Where's my, let's see. All right, let's try that again. I don't think this question is working, so maybe we can just have people put in the chat the most beneficial way for you to stay informed about the project. So I'll move on to the key takeaways for today. We know that the city of Key West has and will be affected by climate threats, and there are areas of increased vulnerability. The city is proactively addressing resiliency by doing the following: further reducing risks to climate threats, aligning local, state, and federal resources with needs of the community, and developing a focused and comprehensive approach to adaptation through this plan. As I mentioned, your input is needed, so we have a few more ways for you to provide input back to the team for the project. If you go to this QR code or this address, you can take our climate adaptation survey. It's about 20 questions. It takes about 3 minutes. You can provide input on locations within the city of Key West that you've experienced flooding, whether it be from extreme rainfall events, from high tides, or storm events, to help us collect additional data related to flooding throughout the city. So with that, I will close the presentation. I'll flip back to that climate slide, but we'll take your questions. Alex, it looks like there's quite a few questions in the Q&A chat.
There are, and our first one, Amber asked about where the seawall was in, I guess, one of your images.
That was in Brickell Bay in Miami.
Thank you. The next question, there was a question about stormwater pumps during Hurricane Ian. I don't know if someone from the city wants to handle that.
I think that's a city question. There are different mechanisms to implement stormwater pumps. There's pumps that are put in place and remain in place, and then there's also temporary stormwater pumps that can be brought in during events to help move water off the land. Anyone from the city?
Well, the person who asked that question was an anonymous attendee. If you want to respond in the Q&A with your name and email address, we can also pass it along to the city and get back to you.
I wasn't sure to what the actual question was, but they do not function when a storm surge is there. They can't move the ocean. They are mostly there for nuisance tides and rains.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. And then Thaddeus asked, how does this work relate to the work that the Army Corps of Engineers is doing? And I think Aaron did a good job at answering that, but if you want to add a little more live.
Yeah, Thaddeus, thanks for that question. I mean, the Corps has very specific authority in terms of what they can fund and what the scope of those coastal storm risk management studies is. We have very specific requirements in the vulnerability assessments, but for the most part, the high end of the sea level rise projections is fairly aligned across the projects. They just have very specific kind of federal authority of like what they can do. For instance, one of the components of that is I think they're doing 6 revetments along the shoreline of US 1. They're also doing voluntary home elevations, and they're also doing commercial property flood proofing. Our study may identify further areas where those types of projects are appropriate, but the state of Florida isn't really funding those types of projects right now at the individual homeowner level, unless it's money coming through FEMA. So, you know, to the extent that there's data that's aligned across the studies, it's great. I think the kind of core question there, oh, that was a terrible pun. The core question about the core study is really the scope of their authority and what they can look at and the types of projects that they can fund under those coastal storm risk management studies.
Thank you, Erin. And I know that I guess folks in Tallahassee there are some bills that would look at providing individual assistance to homeowners, but there aren't programs that exist right now. All right, we have a question. Are there plans for gates to close off when king tides move water into neighborhoods?
We do have what are called duckbill tidal valves. We've put them in before, but they don't last a very long time. We got the city of Key West got a grant through FEMA after Hurricane Irma, where we are putting in another 20 or 30. That will be happening over the coming years. But they do need to be replaced with time. But they do keep the majority of the water coming from coming up through the storm drain.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We do not have any questions in the Q&A, or folks who you can raise your hand if you're not able to use the Q&A function. All right, Georgia and Aaron, we right now do not have any additional questions in the Q&A or hands raised.
All right, well, we hope that you all will continue to track the progress of this project over time. Again, utilizing the website for the Key West Adaptation Plan. We hope that you'll take some time and submit your responses to our community survey with the QR code on the screen. That QR code is also available on the website, and so you can access it that way as well. Allison, do you have any closing remarks?
I just really want to thank everybody that came out on a Tuesday night to listen to this. We will have many more chances as we pull all this data together and some pretty maps to look at. So right now, you know, we're just kind of giving you the broad strokes of the intent, but there'll be definitely some stuff to dig into in the coming months.
Great. All right.
Thank
Well,
you all.
thanks. Thank you all. Have a good night.